I will present the four aspects: climate change impacts vulnerability and resilience, adaptation to climate change, and risk and vulnerability and adaptation assessment. So let us start with the key climate change impacts. First of all, we have to create an understanding what climate change is in the context of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. They define climate change as an attributed or directly or indirectly, and climate change was attributed directly or indirectly to human activities. And they make a distinction between the human activities and the natural climate variability. So we know, when you have worked with this topic, so this is not new for you. We know that climate change have impacts on our human systems, that it has impacts on ecosystems. We experience it daily in the news, almost daily in the news. We had heavy rain showers, for instance. We're experiencing the extreme weather events, and it affects our well-being and also our mobility, other aspects, especially when you're working in the agricultural sector. Let's have a look a little bit more close to key concepts. In climate change impacts, we make a distinction between slow onset events. So these are usually the events when you speak about sea level rising or salination, loss of biodiversity. What is typical for these slow onset events are that they are gradual changes over an extended period. Another type of impact is the extreme weather events. This is more what you are maybe familiar with when you read it in newspapers, and it's more present probably in our mind. These are the sudden, intense climatic occurrences over a short period. So this is drought, heat wave, flooding, and storms. All these impacts create climate risks. Let's have a look to the definition how climate risk is understood. So it is a potential for adverse consequences for human or ecological systems. So risk is a dynamic interaction between different concepts: hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. I will explain these key concepts in detail. Hazards are potential occurrence of natural or human-induced physical event or trend. It's about they cause loss of life or impacts health, loss of property. Exposure is the presence of people or the presence of livelihood, places, settings, which are adversely affected by climate change. And then we have vulnerability, as you see in this graphic, which is the propensity to be adversely affected. So they interact, and obviously you can't see it unfortunately on the slide, but you will get the information at the end of the session as highlighted. This can be impacted by, for instance, the governance process and other factors like the social, economical dynamics, and obviously also the climate, the natural conditions in Trinidad and Tobago will affect them. What we have to keep in mind when we speak about risk and hazards is that sometimes it goes to us when we read the newspaper that's just a single event, but in fact they are multiple climate hazards which interact and which are complex. So we see that a climatic hazard can have several effects and effects, for instance, in different aspects of the human system. Even here you see that the hazard might cause affects the labor capacity. It can create infectious diseases, which then might affect the household income because the breadwinner is affected. And on the other hand, you see it on. So it affects the food protection system, the food yield and quality losses. And this affect probably the food prices, which brings us again back to the human system, that households can have double effects of being double affected by climate change impacts. Particularly the small island development states are affected by climate change and have a higher vulnerability than other countries. And it is important to raise that this disproportionality is recognized in this entire reporting system. So we know for sure that climate change impacts the ecosystem, the terrestrial, freshwater and ocean ecosystems, for instance, and it also affects the human system, for instance, water scarcity is highly affected, and fish and agricultural production. The climate change in Trinidad and Tobago, the vulnerability and capacity assessment reported in 2019 and 2024 that especially agricultural, the agricultural sector will be highly affected by correct me if I'm wrong in the pronunciation, but soil aridity, by salination of soil, and this will, for instance, lead to lower productivity in the agricultural sector. But it will affect, as I said, the human health, human settlement, and especially coastal zones are very vulnerable and affected with erosion, and we have realized that in certain communities, for instance, coastal communities like Charlottesville, or we read it in in the newspaper, Togo will be affected, just to give some examples. How can we measure the effects of climate change? That can be done with loss and damage to make that measurable. What is loss and damage in this context? It is an impact of climate change that occurs despite or in absence of mitigation and adaptation. So even if you took adaptation measures and you still have a negative impact, then this counts as a loss and damage. This terminology is not just a concept which is used loosely. It became a formally recognized concept from the Conference of Paris in 2013, and especially also the small island states were pressing for it, that it was recognized in 2022 to establish a loss and damage fund for compensation, and in 2023, so recently, this has been operationalized. On the spearhead, as I said, were the small island states, because they are disproportionately affected by the climate change. So, for instance, Trinidad and Tobago were spearheading that loss and damage was formally entered the international negotiations already in 1991. So they were very successful in establishing these funding. Important for the loss and damage is to measure it in numbers in order to get compensations for it. And there are two ways to measure it. One is the economic way, that is to quantify the negative impacts and costs and numbers. It's goods which can be treated on a market and exactly be quantified. And then we have the non-economic goods, and that is more difficult to measure, because these are probably, how do you want to quantify the loss of a culture or a loss of a territory? So that is more difficult to quantify. they might use more qualitative data than quantitative data. Important here is the concept, and I mentioned it already in the previous slides, the vulnerability and resilience. So vulnerability encompasses a variety of concepts. It's a sensitivity or the susceptibility to harm and lack of capacity to cope and adapt with it. So the lack of capacity is a key aspect here. So the sensitivity is the magnitude of the direct or indirect effects, and is determined by social, economic, and environmental factors. Important, as I said, is also the adaptive capacity. So there's a system's ability to cope with and respond to adverse events, and that can be shaped by various factors like technology, financial resources, but very important is also the human capacity. That's why this training is very much needed in order to increase the capacity. So it determines its potential to adapt to changing climate conditions. The vulnerability in the small island developing state is disproportionate impacts, despite they have in numbers a lower greenhouse gases emissions. It's still, well, relative, it's still high, but in numbers it's lower. But what we also have to take in consideration is this unique ecosystem what we have, the coastal ecosystem, which is interacting with the land ecosystem. And what is also very particular to small island development states is the geographical remoteness and the size of the territory. So this affects the vulnerability and also the capacity to deal with hazards. We see that agriculture, water resources, and the health sectors are the most affected sectors. They are affected, for instance, by floodings. I have mentioned it. We have different floodings like flash floodings, urban floodings, especially during these heavy rain showers after the dry season. We see that, for instance, areas like Port of Spain are flooded, but also critical infrastructure area like the airport are affected. And this has effects on our entire system. We also see that the coastal ecosystems are affected by the sea level rise, and that is particular important for coastal communities like Charlottesville and Tobago. And for Tobago, it is important because 35% of the communities are coastal communities and are affected directly from it. And then we see, as I said, critical infrastructure can be affected as well. Communities, agriculture, health, and water resources as well. Let's have a look to climate resilience. Given that we have this high vulnerability, it is very important that Trinidad and Tobago, but in particular, but all small island development states, build up as a resilience. Resilience is defined as the capacity of the social, economic, and environmental systems to cope with hazards, events, trends, or disturbance, responding or recognizing in ways that maintain their essential functions and identity and structure. So what does that mean? I'm glad that we can see the figures very well. So it in fact it shows that if we do business as usual and we have an acute hazard, it might affect the country to such an extent that we reaching below the line that a country can functional in its basics systems. So the response takes a little bit longer, and the recovering phase takes also longer, and it might never come back to this starting point. So we're seeing that in countries like Haiti, which really have difficulties to recover from earthquake. So, there will be, There. So there will be a permanent loss. It is better to build up and be proactive, to build and invest in resilience, so that we're starting at a better position. So when the hazards comes, the response is quicker, the recovering time is quicker, and we might even, if we have a good response, we might even reaching a better status quo as before. So that is, that would be the best way to do so. What is important for resilience is that there are timely actions and transition, that although we know that resilience is influenced by available resources, it is important to create these resources on time to build up capacity, and it is very important to have multi-phased approaches, because we realized the effects are multiple effects, complex, and it is very important that we have all stakeholders on board when we speak about resilience. Let's speak about then the adaptation to climate change. What is adaptation in this system? It is, although it might comes from other science, but in a human system, it is defined as adjustment to the actual or expected climate. So in natural systems, it's the adaptation and adjustment to the actual climate effects. And it means that to achieve a sustained engagement of stakeholders, including communities, in order to adapt efficiently. Unfortunately, sustainability, and also we have these slow onset effects, which is difficult to address in a project-based or silo-based approach. That means if we work, for instance, project-based or in silos, then or on short term only, without checking for the longer term effects, we might create a maladaptation. So what might work on a short term, it can have so-called side effects or non-intended effects and creates a maladaptation. What is a maladaptation? So it leads instead to lower risk, it leads to an increased risk, it might lead to increased greenhouse gas emissions, it might diminish welfare. Maladaptation, what I said, can arise from limited administrative, financial or technical resources, inadequate governance and transparencies. This can include, for instance, also non-cooperation and non-sharing of data, right? Therefore, the transparency system is very important. Challenging is also the institutional and legal framework. I already realized we have someone on the table, which is from the legal sector, because maladaptation can result also from the limited legal resources we have. So, and changing the legal system can be time-consuming as well. So a successful adaptation lies in an adequate funding, access to technology, building organizational capacity, and enabling efficient resource utilization and enhance resilience. It's also important to have both processes, not only top-down, so from the government steering down, but that we include all stakeholders bottom-up, and that we have the inclusion on the horizontal, so including all policy sectors and all stakeholders. So it becomes more complex. It is also very important that we do not only follow policy transfer, which means we're taking over solutions and think that one solution fits all. We have to create and be context sensitive and build context sensitive solutions. Type of adaptation methods are infrastructure and engineering solutions. So that is a measure we long followed, because it was the belief that technical solution can bring the solutions always. However, the problem is that these are very costly and very often hard to adapt in the quick changing climate. So we underestimated the speed of climate change as well. What works probably better is nature-based solutions, because they're cheaper and they adapt also by nature to the climate change. But adaptation and solution must be also come in policy, governance, social, community-based adaptation, and obviously, yes, technologies have an important role here. Here's an example how the hard protection or the engineering protection look like. If we have no response, the sea level rise might risk all the, this is a symbol for coastal communities, might risk all the communities, but also all the agricultural areas which surrounding communities, for instance. If we use hard protections, yes, we have that probably, but depending on the adaptation measure, how effective it is, it can still affect the communities. Better would be nature-based solutions, and what we very often see, unfortunately, is that we see an unplanned retreat. We see that communities realize, oh, we're losing areas, coastal areas. So what they do, they go up to the hill, destroy nature here, moving their fields up as well, and that is very unsustainable, because they removing their coastal protection. So better would be a planned retreat with communities in order to have sustainable agricultural techniques and approaches as well. Limitations to adaptation are ecological nature, so constraints, for instance, on protecting the ecosystem, economic, lack of finances and resources, technology, no access probably to certain technologies, or they're very expensive, or they're very expensive to maintain. And socially, it's very, especially for communities, we know how hard it is to change attitudes and approaches. We saw that it sometimes needs extreme events like COVID-19 to change our attitude and to change an approach. However, when the event is gone, we're going back, so no one is washing hands anymore. We can just have our double without washing hands, right? So this can be a limitation as well. Let's have a closer look to nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions are solutions where the nature provides, we could also express it in services, provide essential services. For instance, trees filter the air, give oxygens, and freshwater resources like lakes, rivers give us water, and so they play a crucial role not only for services for us, but also in regulating the climate, and they also create cultural services, not only recreation, that tourism, for instance, depends on it, but we also, the entire culture of Trinidad and Tobago is, for instance, linked to planting sugar cane and having this culture of this process, having it as a heritage as well. So, and recreation as well. So nature-based solutions are defined as action to protect sustainability, manage and restore natural and or modified ecosystems. This is a very good example. We had these replanting of mangroves, for instance, in Suriname. We also have Trinidad and Tobago is very advanced in protecting the mangroves, because they're very important in the services they deliver, from coastal erosion reduction to enhancing biodiversity and systems. Finally, I would like to address risk, vulnerability, and adaptation assessments. So strategic approaches for climate adaptation is, and what is very important in the adaptation process is that we have adaptation frameworks, which provides a structured method of assessing and standards in order to consolidate procedures and measures. So we have climate change climate models, which can help to analyze data, collect data, and make precise forecastings of the future, weather scenarios. We have climate impact risk as vulnerability assessments. We have adaptation assessments, and obviously monitoring and evaluation as part of it. I will address climate models and adaptation as assessments. So adaptation to climate change required, this was, I said, a systematic approach. It requires frameworks that provide a structure. It requires methodologies that helps to prioritize, and it is important to facilitate the integration of climate considerations in the broader policy and planning processes. So climate change models are predicting and provide projection of climate, of key variables in the climate, like temperature and humidity, which is very important for the agricultural sector. They help also assessing the vulnerability, and they can also used for conducting risk assessments in order to create different scenarios which can help in future planning. So climate models are typically computer simulations which predict the future of climate condition based on different variables like greenhouse gases emissions or temperature. These models have different scopes. For instance, we have a global general climate circulation model that models and simplifies the complexity and models for the entire world. There are Earth system models which use additional indicators, not only temperature, but they might use sea ice or ocean circulation or land data from land physics and hydrology. We have Earth system models which use the ocean ecology and the ecosystems in order to make predictions. We have also regional climate models. This example is a Eurocentric model. And what you see, this is a picture, and it shows the hotspots in some areas in Europe. I don't know whether is there a Caribbean-centric model, a regional Caribbean-centric model? If there, this would predict a focus on a specific area, namely the Caribbean, and would make prediction with regards to the temperature, for instance, which is important for the agricultural development as well. Risk assessments are also important assessing tools. So climate risk assessments are essential for understanding and interact with socioeconomic factors, and the overall risk for affected populations. They use observational data, which can be qualitative and quantitative, and they're using statistical records for essential insights. They emphasize plausible outcomes, utilize multidisciplinary expertise. So you as a stakeholder also feed this climate risk assessments with knowledge. So important for adaptation frameworks and methodologies is that you first define your climate, that you make a climate risk assessment to identify your risk. Then you collect the data, analyze data, and to predict who and what has the most risk. And from that you can prioritize your adaptation measures and objectives. So the recommended steps for conducting vulnerability assessments is to determine data-based the climate-related hazards to an area, assess the sensitivity, we spoke about that, and the adaptive capacity, evaluate the degree to which, for instance, people and ecosystems are affected, rating the sensitivity and adaptation capacity from the data, and combine these ratings to an overall assessment. Important is the identification, this, and the prioritization of the adaptation options. So the development of potential options can be either structural listed, they can also be non-structural, and it can be policy measures to address an identified risk. Another assessment is to assess the cost efficiency. That is very important for Trinidad and Tobago, where financial resources are limited, and so important is that adaptation measures, for instance, have a low financial impact, that they can maintain. Otherwise, we're running the risk that we cannot sustain the adaptation measure which was once implemented. So we're going for no cost and high impact, meaning it's most efficient. We probably also can prioritize our adaptation measures according to a prioritization framework. What we do not want is options which are high cost effective and where we would have regret that we have installed these options. So higher in the ranking are no regret options, which are cost effective, and we have no significant trade-offs, so they're not compromising other essential elements. And we want to avoid high cost and high emission options. A high emission option would be, for instance, if we realize that our aging population has difficulties with the heat, we installing more air conditions, because this would increase the greenhouse gas emission. In the agricultural sector, another high cost option would be if you realize that certain crops do not anymore grow in this natural environment, we install greenhouses which are air conditioned, for instance, in order to have that crop available. So that is a really high cost adaptation, and that's not what we want.